Silver Society.
Welcome to the Silver Eye Society podcast. This is our Library Circus series, where we discuss the books that we're reading, which often help to inform the episodes on movies that we do. So, in this Library Circus, we're going...
Silence, you capitalist running dog!
That's where we're going. We're going right into the communist bloc. Is it? That's right. Once upon a time, they called it the communist bloc. Sounds as dystopian as it was. You have read the book for this Library Circus, so why don't you introduce that book?
I would love to. It's entitled simply Lenin. And it has a great cover, which I think that you have, I'd like to show the people. Yeah, it's a great cover, right?
Yeah, it is. It's really aesthetically on point, etc.
Right, so...
Good cover.
There's that, and it is by, the author is Victor Sebastian, I think. Sebastian, I'm assuming is how you pronounce his name. I think he's Hungarianish, maybe from Hungarian stock, Magyar stock, and so it's spelled a little bit differently, but it is in English, and it is a biography of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov.
This is important because Lenin was one of the most important figures in the communist movement, the spread of communism, and it's kind of a cool kid for the Tumblr commies. So we need to deconstruct this. We got a lot of communist sympathies boiling under the surface of our society. I was once one, I have to be honest. When I was, a Tumblr kid, and I was a foolish 17-year-old or something, 18-year-old, let's leave it at that.
A Tumblr Trotskyite. That's what I'll call you.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
It's sufficiently insulting, as is earned. Yeah, I had my communist sympathies. There's something about it, right, that still seems subversive and is attractive. And we're going to talk about particularly what one of those elements are. Why communism seems to have a pull even today. That's kind of what really is the main thing to grapple with about communism, is that this is a system, an ideology that has led to the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. And you can still, for the most part, at least in the United States, you can openly ally yourself with this group, with this ideology, and not face serious social scorn. What's up with that? What's up with the communist sympathies? So particularly, what we're going to talk about is the role that wealthy elites play in fostering communist movements. This is what you read in this book. So maybe you can start off with what in this book you saw the role of these kind of like wealthy elites, right? And like that's something that every society has. They have their wealthy elites. And they have power. But it's a funny thing when you have that connection between these wealthy elites and something like communism that is supposedly so anti the accumulation of wealth, so anti a hierarchy of power. Yet it draws in these very people that are purportedly the targets of communism. And you kind of see something like this now where you have left-leaning celebrities and companies like Nike and Google and whatever kind of promoting certain ideas that fall squarely within the ideology of communism, or at least have their sympathies, right? Whether it's like promoting equity and other kinds of like radical...
Your petite bourgeois meanderings have enraged me. I will now take over. Okay. Silence. I've learned a lot from Vladimir Lenin, to be honest with you.
I'm sure.
Learned a lot.
He's no dummy.
So, okay, let's set this out, though. This is a one-volume biography, and obviously we're not going to try to, in this episode, get into a whole range of topics, which we could. Like the beginning of communism, how it was, the circumstances by which it actually took hold in Russia. We're not trying to cover really even Lenin, the person, that much. We're really focused on just this one thing of why, in particular, in this episode. And I think we may do another episode on it.
And people can let us know also, like, if you're interested in this, leave us a comment and tell us if you'd like more of this kind of focus on, communist history and how it relates to the modern day, because we're trying to figure out what y'all want. So tell us.
Yeah. And I just finished also the first volume of Kotkin's biography of Stalin, which is 750 pages. Just finished that. This one I read actually about a month or two ago. So we got plenty of communism if you want it. Anyway, listen. I'm going to read a passage. I'm going to put my glasses on to do so. The multimillionaire Sava Morozov increased his subsidy to the party, and other industrialists also began giving money to socialist and liberal groups. Quote, it became fashionable to do so, and if it helped their consciousness, we didn't mind the help, said Leonid Krasin, the Bolsheviks' money man. Krasin is a person who was actually in charge of getting money from people and using it. This is the guy who handled many of the donations. He admitted it was a kind of inverted snobbery to support a cause so fundamentally inimical to their personal interests. That's key. At the time, it was regarded as a sign of bon ton, like that doesn't matter, in radical or even liberal circles to contribute money to revolutionary parties. And among those who regularly paid dues were not only prominent attorneys, engineers, and physicians, but also directors of banks and officials from government institutions. So this is in the early days still, when Lenin is exiled. He's in Western Europe, moving around. He's waiting for the right time to return to Russia to start the revolution. And there's all this funding. And this is kind of the point we're trying to get to in this episode, is that why are all these people who ultimately, if the Bolsheviks take over, will be dispossessed of their property, arrested, some executed, some sent into gulags, sent to Siberia. Some, if not that, they have to flee Russia to Western Europe and become exiles themselves. So why does that happen? And then also, do we see any parallels today of people that are wealthy funding, let's say, radical left groups and agendas?
It's fascinating to me. I think there's something so schizophrenic about that perspective, about being a person with wealth and benefiting from a power system that's unequal. And funding and supporting the expansion of a system that specifically and openly aims to redistribute your wealth and strip you of your privileged position. What? So there's two things that I think. It seems that when I look at the parallel to that, because it's easy to look back in history and be like, wow, they were so dumb. But then you see the beginnings of that same phenomenon now. And you see how mundane it looks. You see how unoffensive it seems. How maybe, it's trivial, whatever. For celebrities to create what is essentially political propaganda, where they express collective guilt for being of a certain race or of a certain sex. Where you see people with positions of wealth and power advocating for the decline of meritocracy and instead having positions of privilege and power be allocated through a centralized system, not something that you can gain of your own effort and will.
So, it's dangerous to draw too many direct parallels from this time in history to today, but we will look at some possible ones. Now, this person, Morozov, here, in a different passage, it talks about Morozov was hardly a revolutionary socialist, but he was a shrewd businessman who was convinced the Romanov monarchy was doomed, and he knew how to hedge his bets. So one of the reasons that some of these people were doing this is because they correctly saw that the Tsar at the time was an incompetent buffoon, really a terrible person in a lot of ways also, and they're putting money in organizations with the hope that then if these organizations take power later, they'll be spared, right? Or favored even. And to Lenin's credit, he actually paid back a lot of these loans that were given to the Bolsheviks.
That's funny.
Now, there's a lot. I mean, there's a great deal about this with funding and why it happened, especially. So I guess I wanted to say first off, there's one reason was actually kind of logical. It was, okay, these people may end up taking power, so let's give them some money just in case. And I think you might see aspects of that today in a lot of different ways. In other words, a lot of people will, like you just said, pay credence to these movements and that kind of stuff.
I think you see that with public figures, right?
Right.
You see that with public figures who their livelihood depends on their popularity. And so I think I see that most with celebrities to a degree, and also with companies to a certain degree, right? You can kind of see this with, I know that Nike made Colin Kaepernick, that's the football player that took a knee on the field or whatever, which is all not that interesting of a discussion to me. But there is something interesting about such a powerful and successful company taking a more controversial stance, or so it seems. Realistically, they're likely pandering to a demographic that they think is going to see that favorably, to see this kind of pseudo-revolutionary activist celebrity as the face of their company. This is not a moral action. If they wanted to take a moral action, they could close their gajillion sweatshops with kids making, their shitty shoes. And so the celebrities is the same thing. There's nothing, again, it's like the Oscars we spoke about. There's nothing brave about taking a stance when there are no stakes behind having to take that stance. When, on the contrary, the stakes are not taking a stance, because then all your peers turn around and say, hey, I noticed you didn't post that slogan yet. Are you having different thoughts? That kind of thing. So, of course, you see the celebrities and the very public figure types very, uniformly funnel into the slogan and the issue of the day. That's a ploy. That's in and of itself, it's a kind of power play. It's a marketing move. It is something to secure their own personal position. So, we see this in this historical, examples, it's not necessarily perhaps that they were so sympathetic to the cause, rather than that they saw they would have to shift gears to be able to maintain their own position.
So let's look at another possible motivation for support. And again, I want to reiterate something, which is that the situation in Russia in 1917 is not the situation in the United States in 2022. It really isn't. The effects of World War I is what basically collapsed the government and created this chaos which allowed political actors like Lenin to seize power. And he really did. And people should read this for a variety of reasons, but he was a brilliant person in many different ways. Not a great person in a lot of other ways. But, that's why I really suggest reading this book, because he's also not a paper cut out evil villain exactly either. Now, there is one aspect of this which before I move on to this other point, which I think should be said about him, was that while he ordered the deaths of many people, he did not partake in them or see it. And there's something about this abstraction from real violence that is something I also see today. So Lenin, I think it said maybe in this book, Lenin saw maybe 3 dead bodies in his whole life.
That's crazy.
You know, I mean, like up front, he wasn't someone out there that was fighting on the streets. Now, he did get almost assassinated. He got shot. He got shot at. He didn't lack courage in any way, shape, or form. But
he didn't get his hands dirty, though, in a certain way.
He knew what he was doing. He knew he was ordering the deaths of people.
Well, here's the thing. Then maybe I'll tie this into what we're going on to next, is that as we discuss, why does it seem like people who would be exactly the class of people that would benefit least from supporting communist and radical leftist politics do, in fact, support these things? Maybe it's because these ideas don't come from the lower classes. These ideas are also coming from a similar sphere of upper class, manicured hands types. They are academic ideas. And so...
Oh, that's absolutely the case. So
to your
Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov came from a basically almost near aristocratic. I mean, it's not... He was well off. His father was worked for the Tsar, basically managing school districts. That's what he did. Like, he grew up in a middle class, peaceful, for him, area of Russia. But this is a criticism of a lot of this, is that Karl Marx was German, and he was like writing the Communist Manifesto in the London Library. So there's a lot of, for Russia, it was the importation of a Western idea. That's what communism was. And if you really think about it, I know we're getting a little bit off topic, but it's odd to me that, like, you know, so you have the remaining communist governments today are basically, besides Cuba, all in Asia. About as far away as you possibly could be geographically and to some degree ideologically from, you know, this ideology of communism that comes out. But that's another episode. I want to put us back on the path here to understanding something, which is, here's another person and another motivation for supporting this. This is a lady called Alina Stasova. A clever activist, ran the most successful of all the revolutionary cells in St. Petersburg, would later become one of Lenin's chief aides. Skilled organizer. She explained what the revolutionary movement meant to her in emotional terms that would strike a powerful chord with her comrades. She came from a wealthy background and a loving family. Her parents allowed her to use their country estate as a safe house for activists and a storage place for underground literature. She held illegal meetings where money was raised for Iskra, which means the spark in Russian. That was their newspaper when they were the communist newspaper when they were in exile. At the Stasova's spacious apartment in a fashionable district of St. Petersburg. You can see the portrait of this person. Now, she quotes at the end, "My life is in this and only in this," she wrote from prison after she was arrested. So she actually risked something and was arrested. It was real for her. "No other work can give me the strength to live. Without this work of mine, I cannot live. This is the flesh of my flesh." This sounds like a religious zealot. This is a person a woman who came from privilege, who came from money,
and used whose
parents enabled her to do this, and ends up being arrested, ends up also, you know, serving the administration later. But
oh my God,
there are so many different motivations for why. The question of this episode is, why were people you wouldn't think would be motivated to support particularly Bolshevik communism, the most hardcore part? Why? I mean, so one, we've looked at is a practical reason. Like, you're wealthy, strategic. Okay, maybe these people are going to pay off. Another is this. This person isn't a suffering worker in a factory in St. Petersburg.
This is so funny.
But she found something she believed in.
Which, hey, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, right? But the strange thing is that you would think, okay, this person already has it. They've already made it. So why risk it? That's something that is like a question. Well, you think
she didn't earn it.
Yeah.
So what is she risking? She's risking something that was given to her.
And there's something hollow in that. And I think you can find that in the overcompensation of turning politics into something that sounds like a crusade, essentially, like an ideology turns into a crusade. And I mean, I don't think we can draw the parallels perfectly fine, but I mean, look, it's not working class people. It's not people that are newly immigrants to the United States that were in the autonomous zone in Seattle. It's not people that are working, minimum wage jobs and trying to feed families that are, lobbing little, homemade devices of Molotov cocktails or whatever at the courthouse in Portland. Like, you look into these types of people that really hardcore try to organize, and they're not who you might think. But we're having that same pattern play out. We see it play out in history here, where it's people from privilege, people that other people come here to have their lives, but they are so dissatisfied with their lives that they stir up this kind of chaos for everyone. Now, that being said, in both of these situations, there were legitimate problems. And funny enough, those problems are the ones that are most experienced by the people who are often least interested in that kind of radical political organizing. And so there's a strange savior complex that seems to come up here, where people who actually have obtained a comfortable position in society give themselves a purpose, a crusade, by setting out to save other people who have not asked to be saved necessarily, and not particularly in the ways that they decide to save them. This kind of made me think again about this academic nature to something like communism and these kind of theories. There is like this creepy laboratory element to this, where you have academics and people who have all these ideas on paper that so often go drastically wrong when put into the real world, like centralized planning of food systems, which has led to, I think it's more famines, or at least maybe worse famines, were the ones that were man-made. Or perhaps what it is now is that I think almost all famines now are man-made.
Correct. Now.
Yeah,
that wasn't
now.
the case.
No, of course
even
that wasn't
back
the case.
during
We
this
know
time,
there's famous famines that were real in the past. But some of the famously bad ones were man-made. And so it's like this same idea of, I can take this book idea, this theory, put it into the real world upon masses of people and enact some great outcome. And there's something really kind of like self-important. And I wonder how much that ties into the psychology of this kind of person, right? These people that have, in some ways, more power than anyone else. Whether you want to look at this particular figure you're describing that has a lot of wealth, especially compared to like the disparity in Russia at that time. And then if you want to look at the upper middle class people now that are like, pushing some incredibly destabilizing radical ideas upon the population, that compared to the world hold an incredible amount of power and wealth. I mean, you can just be upper middle class in the United States and you're already you're basically the 1% of the world. But it's that psychology, like that person in that position seems to be the one that's most often prone to want to appoint themselves like social engineer of the entire society. It's a strange kind of like, I don't trust that impulse.
Well, let's explore a few more reasons here. Another person, and there's example after example here. Lydia Goby, daughter of the respected professor of botany at St. Petersburg University, was a convinced Marxist who seemed more of a socialite than a socialist. Does that sound
That's
familiar?
the celebrity persona about it.
So she's the daughter of a professor at a great school, and it goes on. I don't want to spoil the book for anybody, but look, there were people, working class people also, in particular factory workers and people in the armed services of Russia at the time, that did support this. Now, again, this is where it gets very complicated. Maybe we don't want to get into all that exactly. But there was also support from people who weren't of the elite for this particular thing. And that's where I think, to some degree, parallels start to break down with the current situation. Because again, and this is something I think is very key to understand, and I think there is a problem right now with some people who are a little confused, and they kind of just call everything communism that they're not exactly into. That's not really very accurate either. What exactly we're seeing today, I think, differs depending on the situation and the type of thing. Like you're talking about Antifa, there are hardcore like communists and anarcho-communists and things like that. And to be fair, the people that go out on the street and actually do the violence, I don't know how many of those people are from particularly wealthy or elite families. I don't know. It's not like I'm some expert in this or paid a bunch of attention to it. It seems to me more this class of people in our country are more like the Twitter warriors, the people that are like that kind of. I'm not sure that in today's society we actually have the type of people that when things go really wrong, like they did in Russia in 1917, I don't know that I see a lot of like daughters of professors at NYU probably going and manning the barricades, because we simply live in a very rich, very lucky situation compared to the rest of the world. This situation here was there was famine a few years prior to this that was devastating. There was a world war that had killed an unfathomable amount of people, and the Russians suffered a great deal because their military was garbage compared to the German military. The Austro-Hungarian Empire kind of sucked too, but there's a lot of things going on here that aren't what has happened.
Yeah. So you're
Not
talking
what's
about
happening.
like the specifics of each situation. I think it's important, to note that the environment contributes to like maybe the radicalization or like how far people are willing to go. What kind of draws me in and why I bring up something like Antifa or whatever, like these different kinds of more radical politics that we did see kind of spill off of Tumblr and into the real world during like 2020 riots, like particularly in Portland and Seattle, where you have these like ultra liberal and well-off areas. Like Portland is a nice neighborhood. It's a nice city or neighborhood. It's small, but it's a nice city. And Seattle obviously is one of the most expensive cities you can live in. So, and they're some of the most liberal, if not the most liberal, more than New York and LA, which are so big that they actually have more diversity in politics like that. And so you saw this kind of spill out into the streets. And
remember the mayor of, it was either Portland or Seattle.
No, it was Seattle.
And in all of this, so the parallel I see is more this kind of political class that kind of okays all this.
Oh, this is Portland you're talking about. That's Portland.
And
then the guy was like,
he went out to talk. Yeah, and then he went out to talk to the protesters, and they were like throwing bottles at him. And then at some point, they came to his apartment building and were protesting. And then all of a sudden, he kind of turned around and was like, "Oh, we should arrest people." So he's more. There's parallels to that type of figure also during the Russian Revolution.
That doesn't act fast enough. That it kind of doesn't take things seriously in time.
Middle ground type people don't do well in revolutions. It's actually better to be hardcore one way or the other. And again, I won't spoil the book or the outcome of the Russian Revolution. But what ends up happening is the people like Lenin and later people like Stalin, and there's a whole host of other people. Their main target in a lot of ways, especially early on, is to eliminate the people that are just basically the liberals. That's more than the it's a big story. There goes into a civil war. There's like a hardcore white, it's called the White Russians or whatever. It's not an ethnic or skin color tone thing. It's Reds or the Bolsheviks. Or it's the whites, whatever. It's a terrible, horrific story of things that gave me nightmares reading about it. But the point is that you had a guy at one point who was a general of the hardcore right, who was trying to establish himself as the Khan of Mongolia and would tear the hearts out of his victims and eat. I mean, there's like this gets to that's where like it's important to read history because it is important to have context, and that's why I don't want to draw too many sharp parallels with today and to say, oh, look at all the communists. Like these were serious fucking people, and these were serious people in dire circumstances that were life and death. And I think that we're lucky enough right now that we're not in that position as Americans, or really even in a lot of places in the world.
I always push back on you about this because I think that position is movable.
It is.
And so I don't think that we don't have the type of people that do that. I think those type of people haven't been formed because they're not in the situation
Correct.
that would form them to become
Yes.
that. And that is actually one of maybe the best takeaways that you get from learning history is that you should do everything possible to avoid enacting the kind of environments that lead to forming people who rip out and eat their enemies' hearts as a display of their prowess. Because
There's
they
no
exist.
doubt. I am that person, and you are that person. But I'm joking slightly. But the thing is the key is that actually we are these people. It's the circumstances that push people. Not everyone is like that. First off, I should say.
No, some people are the mayor of Portland. They go real quick. They're the first ones to get taken out. Some people get their hearts ripped out and eaten. Other people do the ripping and the eating. So, and some people just restrain the victims.
Circumstances what leads to this type of violence on a large scale. Mm-hmm. I think that it's useful to see the psychological problems, mistakes, the psychological, not even a mistake or problem, just the makeup of human beings that make them do the things that lead to terrible things.
So
that's all.
This kind of reminds me, when we were getting ready for this episode, I thought about Rob Henderson's idea of luxury beliefs. So you might have seen that episode with Peterson where he talks about it more in depth. But essentially the idea is that you have, he kind of likens it to social ideas that are like foregoing marriage or having kids out of wedlock, and how these are kind of like trends or novelties that upper classes will toy with, but eventually lower classes emulate upper classes, whether it's fashion or social beliefs. And as they begin to emulate these ideas, as they kind of like trickle down throughout the culture, they devastate the people that actually need like foundational beliefs and systems and can't toy around with things like children out of wedlock or something like that can actually cause you legitimate difficulties in raising your children or having a life or some kind of stability and happiness. Whereas, of course, you have children out of wedlock as, a well-to-do woman, just hire a nanny. It's all fine. Whatever. What's the difference? So, of course, there are still differences. But then the problem is with those things is that they get found out so much later. So much later we find out, oh, actually it does help kids to have two parents in the home or something like that. But by then it's already become something that is larger in the culture and it's harder to roll things back. Now, I thought about this idea of luxury beliefs. I love the phrasing of that because that's exactly what I see when I see kind of like college campus aged people toy with the language of revolution. And I have to kind of dissect my own past college campus self in talking about that because I was one of those people before it was cool. That's my one saving grace is that I actually like embraced all these radical ideas when no one else was, when it wasn't part of the institution, when it wasn't something that you heard from Disney or Nike, when no one in your, college campus class was saying free speech is damaging. That wasn't there. I was, though. I wasn't saying that. I was never that ridiculous. But, I mean, why? What appealed to me, especially as someone that has a background with family that escaped communism, Cuban heritage. And I think it was the disconnect. So I was born in the United States. I didn't live in Cuba. And I hadn't even been to Cuba at that point. And so it comes back to how abstract and intellectual these communist ideas can be. These ideas of, well, why don't we just tax the rich and then use that money to fund these nice social programs? And it's like, there's all these little pieces along the way that can become corrupt and can completely fall apart. And it's not that simple, especially when it comes to things like enforcing quotas of how many people you're going to hire or things like this. And particularly pernicious was my view on the role of force in creating a better society. I recall it was like this kind of shitty college kid mindset where it's like, well, if I can argue it, then I win the argument. And if I can argue it, then that's good enough. As opposed to really seriously trying to consider whether the idea actually held water and would stand up when put into the real world. So something like force. It's like, well, if people are, if you want to make a better society, well, you're going to have to crack a few eggs type of things. All of that sounds great when you intellectualize it, when you have this idea of some utopia in mind. But then, like, the more I learned about history, that was what mainly changed things, was that I learned more about history, but there was also a shift in that it's crazy, I guess I took words and ideas more seriously. Like I didn't use words as just a means to kind of like win my argument or get to the goal. I actually took them seriously. Like, what did it mean when I said, well, we should be able to use some force to make a better world? What does that actually entail? If you really take these ideas seriously, they're fucking horrifying. And then it's like, how can you justify, oh, well, it was done wrong or whatever, we'll do it differently, when you have this mass history of some of the most inhuman, unimaginable suffering caused by people and their ideas that you can point to? How do you justify that? It takes a lot of dishonesty. Like, I think it takes a lot of intellectual dishonesty and maneuvering and idealism. And so that's luxury
and
beliefs.
Ignorance.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably ignorance.
Lack of knowledge of history, like I mentioned.
I think, and this is a problem that we still haven't resolved, which is that a lot of Americans simply don't know the history of communism and the violence, because we fought with the Red Army on the same side during World War II. And that's had a legacy of where we were allies with them versus the fascists. And now later comes the Cold War and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of people just don't know this history. And a lot of people just don't know these figures. You've heard of Lenin, you've heard of Stalin. But, I think that we'll maybe end this episode soon. But I would like to say one other thing about motivations. We've talked a little bit about the motivations of just wanting to hedge your bets for political reasons. We've talked about a little bit of this kind of like socialite communism. And part of that is kind of like, it's fun, like
it's subversive.
Until you get sent to Siberia. And then I think we also touched on another motivation, which was kind of a religious feel, like taking
like a filling of the void.
A religious feeling from the ideology. But then there's also something else that needs to be recognized, which is that Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, his name was not Lenin. Little fact for you guys. Lenin was a pseudonym he took on. He took on hundreds of pseudonyms while he was in exile because he was constantly in disguise, running around the different places, faking passports, doing documents, all that kind of stuff. Lenin is not his name. But he believed. And he believed till the day he died. He believed in Marxism. And he truly believed in what he was doing. In fact, I think that it requires to some degree, there's different types of personalities you see. But to give the orders that some of these people gave, I think you have to truly believe in what you're doing. And I think he does. And maybe we'll talk about some of the morality of that later. But another brief note before we sign off here is that it's just an interesting thing to me. Stalin studied in a Orthodox Christian seminary at an early age. One of the heads of the secret police in the early days, I can't pronounce his name very well, Jurinsky or something, it's Polish. He was Polish. He studied in a Catholic Christian extreme, I can't remember what it is, but like a very like hardcore religious environment in his early days. A lot of these people, not all, but many, bring this displaced religious upbringing into their political ideology. Not so much Lenin. He was pretty much an atheist for, I think, most of his life. But anyway, it's interesting to me to study the psychology of these people, to understand, to read about them, to this book is a book about a human being that's just a fascinating individual. I mean, say what you want, Lenin's life is like an adventure novel.
Yeah.
So that's why this book is worth checking out. It's pretty important, I think, and it's short. It's very easy to read.
That's
good. It's short. It's about 470 pages, but it's big type.
Because those books sometimes are intimidating, especially like because it's such a figure. I always just think like, oh my gosh, how can they possibly cover that person's life in a book that's not, encyclopedic sized?
Well, this one's pretty easy to read, and I suggest it highly.
Very good. Well, I think we have done our part to fight the communists today at the Silver Eye Society. If you feel like your efforts to fight communism are waning, are flailing, we have an option for you. Join the Silver Eye Society as a patron. You can join at low cost of $2 a month, and then you get the full version of our AMAs where you can ask for more ways on how to fight Lenin's ghost. All right, Thank you for watching. Subscribe, like, send us your comments. Tell us what you like. We want to hear from you. It's very cool.
I accuse you of factionalism, you Menshevik. I accuse you. I just wanted to yell at you again. I like yelling these insults, these communist insults that
They sound very, they're very impactful. I'm gonna have
While you're trying to do your introduction and your outro, I think it's important that I do that. Thank you.
Menshevich?
Oh my God. Do you know what has almost happened?
What?
We almost forgot to do the word of the podcast. I just realized it, and that helped me remember. Word of the podcast. Word of the podcast.
Throwing it in here at the end.
Very briefly.
Good.
Bolshevik. What does Bolshevik mean, you know?
Yeah, okay. I actually think I know this, but I can't remember. I know that it's like bol is a thing, and then shevik is like, you know, there's a meaning.
Okay,
like
close.
people of something, or I don't know.
Okay. So this is Lenin was being Lenin. So there was a meeting somewhere in Western Europe or somewhere, I can't remember. And he was always about taking power. And so there was a vote, and the party that was against him actually had more votes. And so he named their party, their faction, the Mensheviks, which means the small minority ones. And he named himself the Bolsheviks, which means the great or the majority. So Bolshevik, I mean, like it comes from this idea of big majority, even though it was a lie, because he actually, during that vote, lost the vote. He was in the minority, but then and this is where it's very important to learn learn the lessons of the people of the past. He just ignored that fact and called the people that were against him the minority party, and it stuck. And in the year 2022, it is the word of the podcast.
That's so interesting, because it really makes you reconsider the gravity of some of the word games we see. Like, it's important not to cede, you know, authority over language too easily, because it has an impact. It clearly has an impact, and I think he knew that. And Bolshevik,
he did know
is a very
that, and then
famous word.
they just walked away. I mean, they just took it.
They
just took it. They accepted it. But another brief thing, you know, I think Lenin would be a podcaster today, would be my guess. So many of these people, himself included, when asked what his occupation was, said writer and editor. Because that's really what he mainly was. He mainly sat in Western Europe writing articles about communism. It wasn't until the moment in 1917 when he crossed the border from Finland in disguise. I won't go on. Such an interesting book. Please, you should check it out. It's really fun to read. I mean, it's a lot of great stories. Great stories.
Great stories from history. All right. Now, this time, truly, see you on the next episode.